King Charles had entered the morning, expecting a difficult discussion. He did not expect to hear that one of the most emotionally charged collections connected to Diana had effectively moved beyond his control. When the Privy Council delivered its ruling, the room changed instantly. The decision was precise, devastating, and deeply personal. Diana's private tiara collection was to belong to Prince George. Charles did not argue at first. He simply stared at the page. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept his eyes fixed on the final paragraph, as Prince William sat across from him at Buckingham Palace, saying nothing. Senior advisors remained tense around the table, while the council representatives waited for the king to respond. The Privy Council, a formal body of senior advisors whose decisions can carry serious constitutional and administrative weight, had reached a conclusion Charles had never expected to face. Diana's designated tiara collection belonged to George as the named dynastic beneficiary. That meant the monarch could not redistribute the pieces, lend them elsewhere, or permanently assign them to another member of the family. Charles read the paragraph again, then once more. His hand tightened against the edge of the page before he slowly lowered it and asked only one word. "George?" The disbelief in his voice was unmistakable. This was not simply a ruling about jewelry. It cut directly into his expectations as sovereign and father, because something deeply connected to Diana had now passed beyond his personal authority. William noticed the change immediately. The prince understood that his son had inherited something far heavier than diamonds and metal. George had inherited a piece of his grandmother's unfinished emotional legacy. William stayed controlled, but the tension in his face deepened when one advisor explained that a single tiara carried an old handwritten succession instruction. That instruction identified the collection as protected family property rather than ordinary royal inventory, meaning the palace could not quietly absorb it into the wider jewelry holdings. The detail changed everything. Charles leaned forward and demanded to know why he had never been shown the instruction before. William answered that he had not submitted it and had not asked the council to reopen the matter. His denial only made the room colder. Charles reached for his reading glasses, then stopped. A representative placed a second reference beside the ruling and explained that the review had been triggered by an older sealed record recently introduced into the council's files. The king immediately looked toward William, but the future monarch shook his head again. Whatever had begun this process had started somewhere else. Charles set his glasses beside the ruling and pressed one hand flat against the table. He ordered everyone in the room not to contact George until he had spoken privately with William. Then his eyes returned to the name attached to the sealed record. Recognition replaced shock. The battle over Diana's tiaras had not begun that morning. It had begun years earlier, and before Charles could understand why his grandson had been chosen, he first had to confront what Diana's legacy meant to every person now standing around that table. For Prince George, the ruling was not yet about wealth, ownership, or royal privilege. It was about a grandmother he had never met. For William, that made the news almost unbearable to explain. And for Charles, watching father and son become tied to Diana through a collection he could no longer control, reopened an old wound he had spent decades learning how to carry without showing it. William carried the burden into Windsor quietly. He rejected the idea of an aide delivering the news because George was not receiving an ordinary palace update. He was being drawn into the line of succession personally. The line of succession is the order in which royals stand to inherit the throne, and George's place behind his father made every object attached to him matter beyond private sentiment. The prince knew jewelry could become history once meaning attached to it. George listened without interrupting. When William explained that Diana's collection would eventually pass to him, the boy asked the question his father had feared. Why him? Why not William? The future king paused because the answer touched grief he had learned to control, not erase. He explained that the collection was not one simple group of crown-owned jewels. Some pieces were family-held, some privately designated, and others protected by older arrangements that gave emotional intent unusual weight. George lowered his eyes. George reached toward a closed archival box and traced one finger along its edge. He did not open it. William stopped him gently and said they would see the pieces together when the family understood why they were protected. Then he shared something preserved in a documented family account. Diana had once worried that personally meaningful jewels could lose their identity if absorbed into wider palace holdings. William spoke softly. That restraint made the admission hurt more. Charles felt that pain from another direction. In a private conversation with William later that day, the king admitted he had expected part of the collection to remain under sovereign discretion, meaning under the monarch's authority to manage royal assets and ceremonial use. The ruling felt like more than inheritance. It felt like an unspoken judgment on choices made after Diana's death, choices he believed were settled. William let the silence stretch before answering. He told his father there was a reason George had been chosen, and it did not begin with the council. It began years earlier, inside a palace ceremony, when one tiara was prepared for display, and one quiet decision changed everything. And the answer would lead them backward, to one palace ceremony where a single decision quietly changed the fate of the entire collection. Years before the council ruling, one royal evening had ended with an argument so contained that almost nobody outside the palace knew it happened. A tiara associated with Diana had been prepared for a private historical display. Then, hours before the event, its label was changed, its family connection softened, and its future status questioned. What looked like a minor curatorial decision became the moment that triggered everything Charles was facing now. William entered the private Windsor preview, expecting a quiet inspection before the heritage reception. The reception had been designed to present selected royal jewels as part of modern royal history, giving each piece a clear place within the family's story. One tiara stood apart, because its original wording identified it directly with Diana and described it as part of her protected family collection. That phrase mattered. It separated personal legacy from ordinary palace management. William stopped when he saw the replacement card. Hours before the reception, a senior palace official had ordered the wording changed, removing the phrase that linked the tiara to Diana's protected collection. The prince demanded an explanation immediately. He argued that the change did more than shorten a label. It weakened his mother's place in the record and turned something emotionally specific into something administratively convenient. Charles stepped into the dispute before it could spread. The king urged calm, telling his son that one exhibition card did not decide ownership or erase history. William heard something different. To him, caution sounded like surrender. He placed the rewritten card beside the original version and asked his father to read both aloud. Charles looked down at them. He refused. The silence that followed cut deeper than a raised voice. Princess Anne broke that silence with something nobody expected. She produced an older inventory reference, preserved in a documented archival account, showing that the disputed pieces had once been managed separately from the general royal jewelry collection. An inventory is simply an official record listing what is held, where it belongs, and how it is classified. Anne pointed to the old designation and told both men that changing public wording could eventually blur the legal meaning attached to the collection itself. Anne did not stop there. After the confrontation, she insisted that both versions of the display wording, the older inventory, and the internal instructions surrounding the tiara be preserved together. That decision created a paper trail. Years later, those records would reach the Privy Council and become part of the evidence behind George's inheritance. Charles learned afterward that his sister had done more than protect paperwork. In a recorded private family conversation, Anne had challenged him directly over who possessed the right to decide the collection's future. She had warned that sovereign authority could not simply swallow a personal designation because palace administration found it easier. That silence survived for years. Now, with the council's ruling delivered, Charles and William could no longer avoid the confrontation it had postponed. The palace could contain legal arguments. It could not contain what happened when Charles and William were finally left alone. The ruling had transformed an old disagreement into something neither man could dismiss. Charles believed his authority had been publicly narrowed inside his own family. William believed Diana's wishes had finally been protected. Between them stood George, a child becoming heir to a legacy neither man had fully resolved. Charles closed the oak room door at Windsor and dismissed every aide before taking his seat. He wanted no witnesses, no advisors, and no official language to soften what had become deeply personal. The dispute was no longer simply about who owned a group of tiaras. A dynastic designation is a private instruction identifying who within a family line should ultimately receive or control an asset. And the ruling had made one question impossible to avoid. Could a monarch override such an instruction merely because the object carried royal history? Charles spoke first. He told William the council had turned a family matter into a judgment on his stewardship, as though every decision made after Diana's death was now being examined through suspicion. The king did not raise his voice, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. He had expected disagreement. He had not expected to feel stripped of discretion inside his own household. William listened carefully, then answered with equal restraint. William said Diana's memory had repeatedly become vulnerable whenever emotional meaning collided with institutional convenience. He reminded his father of the rewritten display card, the softened language, and the years of uncertainty that followed. Charles pushed his chair back sharply. The prince did not move. Neither man shouted. That made the confrontation harsher, because every sentence landed without the escape of anger. Charles finally revealed something he had never admitted to his son. In a documented private conversation, preserved by a palace secretary, he had once considered placing one of Diana's tiaras into a rotating royal collection, available to senior women for major occasions. To him, the idea had represented continuity. To William, it proved exactly why the protected designation mattered. His mother's personal legacy could have been transformed into shared ceremonial property without anyone meaning to erase her. William then offered his own revelation. He had known for months that the protected designation existed. He had deliberately refused to contact the council, submit evidence, or influence the review, because any intervention from Diana's eldest son could have made the outcome appear engineered. Charles stared at him. For the first time, the king understood that William had stepped away from the process, rather than driven it. Charles leaned forward and asked the question that changed everything. Then, who pushed this before the council? William waited. Anne. The confrontation had exposed the wound, but not the hand that forced it open. And that hand belonged to the one royal Charles had underestimated. Princess Anne had not argued in public, leaked documents, or demanded attention. She had done something far more dangerous inside royal machinery. She had kept records. While others treated Diana's tiaras as a sensitive family inheritance, Anne treated the wording surrounding them as a duty that could not be rewritten for convenience. By the time Charles understood what she had preserved, the council already had everything it needed. Charles went to his sister without an advisor beside him. Anne had been present during earlier internal discussions about how Diana-linked jewels were classified and who should control them, which meant she understood the difference between sentiment and legal custody. Custodianship simply meant who had the formal responsibility to protect and manage an item, even when that person did not personally own it. She had always believed private wishes attached to family pieces should remain separate from the monarch's broader ceremonial authority. Charles asked the question immediately. Why had she never warned him that she had submitted the old inventory trail for review? The king sounded controlled, but the accusation beneath his words was clear. Anne felt it. Her expression hardened, not from anger, but hurt. She answered that warning him would have turned an evidentiary question into a family negotiation. Evidence, she said, either survived intact or it did not. She refused to let affection, rank, or fear change that. Anne then revealed, through a documented account preserved with the palace files, exactly what she had kept. She had retained the original Windsor display wording, the revised version that weakened Diana's connection, and the earlier inventory entry separating the disputed tiara from general royal jewelry management. Charles looked at the papers but said nothing. The princess knew the silence meant he understood how damaging the trail had become. Anne had preserved something even more decisive. An authenticated note, attached to the protected collection, directed that the pieces eventually pass through William's direct family line to his eldest child. The wording was simple, but its effect was enormous. George had not been chosen because William demanded it. He had been named because the original instruction led there. Charles accused his sister of acting against him. Anne's composure finally cracked. She told him she had acted for the integrity of the family record, not against her brother. Then, she slid a duplicate inventory across the desk. The king did not pick it up. Anne stood and delivered one final warning. The legal ruling was settled. The emotional consequences were not. Camilla had now received the revised jewelry restrictions, and she had learned exactly what the decision prevented her from doing. Anne left the inventory between them and walked out. And outside that room, another royal was discovering that the ruling had quietly closed a door she had assumed would remain open. Queen Camilla did not lose a title, a role, or a place beside the king. Yet the ruling created a boundary that could not be ignored. Diana's tiaras were now formally separated from the jewelry available under Charles's discretion. That distinction carried extraordinary emotional force. When Camilla received the revised jewelry briefing, one line made the consequences unmistakable. The protected collection could not be worn, reassigned, or loaned without George's future authority. Camilla read the updated list alone. Palace jewelry staff had changed the internal access rules immediately after the council decision, and several pieces she had once believed might be available for major state occasions were now gone from the schedule. Restricted custodial management meant the collection would be protected and administered by appointed guardians until George reached the fictional age required to exercise control himself. The Queen Consort understood the language. What hurt was what it represented. Camilla stopped at one entry and read it again. A centerpiece tiara planned for an anniversary exhibition had been removed from royal display authority, forcing palace staff to rewrite the event because the piece could no longer appear without approval under the new arrangement. She closed the briefing and sat in silence. The decision did not publicly humiliate her, yet privately it drew a line around Diana's legacy that she could neither cross nor soften. Charles found her with the folder closed beside her. The king immediately understood what she had read. Camilla told him she would not contest anything linked so deeply to Diana, and she would not allow her discomfort to become another family battle. Still, she admitted in a recorded private conversation preserved by an aide that the exclusion stung. Charles did not defend the ruling or challenge her reaction. He simply stayed beside her, knowing that words would make the moment worse. Camilla opened the folder once more and removed the jewelry schedule. She folded it carefully, handed it to an aide, and instructed that every reference to Diana's protected pieces be returned to the archivist. An archivist is the official responsible for preserving historical records and keeping their identity and provenance intact. Her decision was quiet but absolute. She would not fight for access. Then another update arrived. George's name had been entered into the internal trust record, turning his future authority from an idea into an official responsibility. Charles read the notation twice. The same grandson whose name had shocked him at Buckingham Palace now stood permanently inside the collection's history. Camilla looked toward him and asked what would happen next. Charles did not have time to answer. George had already made a request of his own. He wanted to see the collection personally, and he wanted his grandfather beside him. The ruling had divided authority, reopened old pain, and unsettled the household. Then George made one request that none of them expected. George could have asked William to accompany him. Instead, he asked Charles. The request startled everyone, because it removed lawyers, advisors, and palace procedure from the most sensitive moment of the entire dispute. Grandfather and grandson would face Diana's collection together. For Charles, that meant confronting an inheritance connected to one of the most complicated chapters of his life. For George, it meant deciding what kind of meaning those objects would carry next. George entered the private viewing with an unusual calm. Formal control of the collection would remain protected until he reached adulthood, but he had been permitted to see what would one day become his responsibility. Custodial protection meant the pieces could be preserved and managed for him without giving him immediate legal authority over them. William had agreed that Charles should accompany his son, because keeping the king away would only turn the collection into another symbol of division. Charles slowed before the final door and spoke without ceremony. He told George that objects could become heavier than they appeared when families attached memory, regret, and unfinished arguments to them. The king had spent years watching Diana's name pull old emotions back into rooms where everyone believed they had been contained. George listened, then answered with a simplicity that unsettled him. He did not want the tiaras to become weapons between relatives. George looked across the protected collection until he reached the piece that had started the Windsor dispute. Its original Diana-linked archival designation remained intact. An archival designation is the official description used to preserve an object's identity and historical connection inside permanent records. Charles recognized the wording immediately. Years earlier, that same language had been softened. Now it had survived him, the palace argument, and every attempt to simplify what the tiara represented. George asked the question Charles had been expecting, but still feared. Was his grandfather angry that the collection belonged to him? The king answered immediately. I was shocked. That isn't the same thing. George studied him for a moment, then said he wanted the pieces to explain Diana's place in the family one day, not remain locked away as evidence of a fight. Charles felt something shift. The argument had always been framed around control. Who could wear the tiaras? Who could manage them? Who had the authority to decide? George had changed the question entirely. He was asking what the collection should teach. George reached toward the disputed tiara, then stopped before touching it. Instead, he turned to Charles and asked what he remembered about Diana wearing royal jewelry. The monarch hesitated, but this time he did not retreat into silence. He began to answer. By the time grandfather and grandson left the room, the palace argument had changed. Within hours, the country would change it again. The council ruling had begun behind closed doors, but it could not remain there. Once the palace confirmed that Diana's protected tiara collection would pass to George, the story erupted beyond royal walls. For some, it was a succession decision. For others, it felt like Diana's name had been written back into the future of the monarchy. And one morning outside Kensington Palace, that emotion became impossible to reduce to headlines. Charles watched the coverage without speaking. The palace had issued a formal acknowledgement confirming George's future custodial rights, while refusing to discuss the family's private disagreements. Custodial rights meant the protected responsibility to control, preserve, and eventually decide how an inherited collection could be used. Broadcasters framed the ruling as an extraordinary link between Diana and a grandson born years after her death. The king heard his own shock repeated beside George's name again and again. William reacted differently. He worried that his son was being turned into a national symbol before he was ready to carry that weight. The prince asked palace staff to keep George away from questions, cameras, and public comment while the story spread. He understood why the public felt moved, but he also knew what attention could do to a young heir. George had inherited responsibility. William did not want him to inherit pressure before he understood the difference. By Sunday morning, the story had become impossible to contain. A newspaper ran a fictional front page dominated by Diana wearing a tiara, with a smaller recent image of George beside the headline, "Diana's legacy passes to George." Outside Kensington Palace, a crowd gathered near the gates, with flowers and handwritten cards. One message read simply, "From grandmother to grandson." Broadcasters returned to that card repeatedly because it captured the public mood better than any palace statement. Charles saw the image and stayed still. The words struck harder than the legal language ever had. Diana's name was no longer being discussed only through grief or old conflict. It was being connected to George's future. That changed the emotional balance. The king could resist a ruling in private, but he could not ignore what the inheritance had come to represent beyond palace walls. Then the palace made a second announcement. The collection would eventually be interpreted through a family heritage program approved jointly by Charles, William, and George, rather than treated as usable ceremonial inventory. A heritage program meant the pieces would be preserved and explained through their family history instead of simply being worn at royal occasions. The decision turned possession into memory. The nation had already given the ruling its meaning. What remained was for Charles to decide what it would mean to him. Charles began this story staring at a ruling he never expected, convinced that authority had been taken from his hands. He ended it facing something far more personal. Diana's tiaras had not diminished his position. They had forced 3 generations of his family to confront memory, inheritance, and the difference between possessing history and protecting it. When Charles finally spoke to William and George together, the argument that had divided the palace reached its definitive end. Charles gathered them privately at Windsor, after the public reaction had begun to settle. No advisors sat between them. No palace officials shaped the conversation. The king placed the original Privy Council ruling on the table and told both of them he would accept it in full. The Privy Council was the senior advisory body, whose decision had formally settled control of the collection, and his acceptance meant palace staff would make no further attempt to reclassify Diana's protected pieces. Charles turned first to George. He told his grandson that the tiaras were not a prize, and ownership did not give anyone the right to forget what they represented. They were now a responsibility to protect. George listened carefully, understanding that one day custodianship would place the collection under his care, rather than simply in his possession. The young heir promised that Diana's name would remain part of every decision he made about them. Charles then faced William. The king admitted that the earlier Windsor dispute should never have allowed his mother's memory to become an administrative argument. He acknowledged that changing labels, debating classifications, and protecting institutional convenience had created pain that could have been avoided. William had wanted that recognition for years. He did not answer immediately, but the silence between father and son no longer felt hostile. Charles made the settlement permanent. Through a signed palace directive, he approved an archival designation preserving Diana's name beside every protected piece. An archival designation is the permanent historical description used to preserve an object's identity and recorded history. Anne's preserved inventories would remain part of the collection's provenance, the documented chain showing where an object came from and how it was held. Camilla also confirmed in a recorded private conversation that she would never seek access to the pieces. Charles picked up the ruling that had shocked him at the beginning. He signed the palace acknowledgement accepting its terms, then passed the pen to William. No second signature was required. The gesture was personal. George watched without speaking as his father took the pen and understood what his grandfather was finally offering. Not surrender, but reconciliation. The tiaras would belong to George. Diana's name would remain attached to them. William finally saw his mother's wishes protected. Anne saw the record preserved. Camilla accepted the boundary. And Charles accepted something larger than a legal defeat. Some inheritances are meant to pass beyond a sovereign's control. In doing so, the monarchy did not erase its most painful history. It made room for it, and finally allowed the next generation to carry it forward without shame. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.